Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for our penultimate forum panel, Partners and Allies. In this panel, Dr. Rob Burrell from Joint Special Operations University will guide a discussion about SOF's role in establishing and maintaining partnerships and alliances and what those relationships should look like in the future. Dr. Burrell is an instructor of irregular warfare at JSOU and previously taught at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is also a retired Marine and Asia-Pacific expert. His panelists include officers and non-commissioned officers from the militaries of Poland, Australia, and the United States. Dr. Burrell, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to participate in this JSOU forum. In this panel, we'll be talking about special operations and its role in deterrence, taking particular account for partnerships and allies. Our first panel member is Brigadier Brett Chandler, who is an Australian Special Operations Officer. He currently commands 13th Brigade in Western Australia. He has a host of experience in combating terrorism and counterinsurgency. He's a recent graduate from the Higher Defense College in India, and he's joining us today from Perth. Colonel Jaroslaw Jablonski is a Polish Special Operations Officer. He currently serves as an exchange officer to U.S. Special Operations Command. He has 3 decades of experience with peacekeeping, combating terrorism, and counterinsurgency. And our other panel member is Sergeant First Class Jarrid Johnson, who's a Special Forces leader. He has served multiple tours in Afghanistan and recently deployed to the Baltic in support of NATO. He currently serves at U.S. Military Academy, where he teaches combat leadership and combat diving. You can find the biographies of all our panel members on the forum website, and they're all quite impressive. I want to reemphasize that the opinions expressed during the session are solely of the panel members and do not necessarily represent those of Australia, Poland, or the U.S. government. For those in the audience, please provide us questions. Bring them on. We understand that war in Ukraine is an important topic, and we'll prioritize those questions about current events for this panel. So please put those, type those questions into the chat box so we can get to them. All right, some context. So recently, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, stated that the cornerstone of American defense is deterrence. I think we all been kind of wrestling with his vision. He has also introduced the term integrated deterrence as a framework of future American strategy. So Mr. Austin's vision for integrated deterrence includes some of the following ideas which he's discussed. Most of these are American-centric. Advanced technologies and weapon systems, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synchronization of the joint force, not just air, land, and sea, but space and cyberspace, increased collaboration within the U.S. interagency, and last but not least, cooperation with partner nations. So with integrated deterrence potentially playing a significant role in the fourth age of SOF, what does it actually mean for future special operations? And that's what we want to explore today, particularly those aspects involving our partners. So let's get to the questions. So a question for our Australian and Polish guests: is deterrence part of your national strategy? If you could give us some insight on that. And if so, what are the most important aspects of that approach, and where could we potentially collaborate in the future? Brigadier Chandler, can you give us an Australian perspective on deterrence?
Well, g'day, Rob and ladies and gents. It's a pleasure to be part of this, and certainly thank you for having me dial in from Perth. Hey, of interest, Australia doesn't yet have a national security strategy, but in 2020 we established a defence strategic update, which was a pretty good alternative in the short term. And it came up with 3 pillars, which probably not surprisingly were shape, deter, and respond. And we also, not surprisingly, often draw inspiration from the US approach to the national strategy. So, deter and deterrence is one of the pillars. And in terms of how it's prescribed, it talks about defence requiring to develop a new set of capabilities, and it really highlights the fact that we need to hold potential adversaries and forces at risk from a greater distance. It also highlights that while we need to grow an increasingly self-reliant capability and deterrent effect, that we need to focus on our ability to match particular capabilities with major powers, but not all capabilities. It further goes on to talk about how we need to be able to operate more effectively in the grey zone. So as a consequence of that, we we special operations have a significant role to play in all three pillars, but particularly in the deterrence pillar. And from that point of view, the strategic guidance given to Australian Special Operations Command has been to develop across all three pillars, but focus on the shape and deter in particular. And the current Special Operations Commander, General Paul Kenny, who's known to many of you, has really chosen to focus on deliberate action and experimentation activities in stride to rapidly accelerate us towards viable outcomes in all of those areas and domains. So that's just a start point in terms of how we're starting to look at the deterrence effect.
Thank you, Brigadier. Colonel Jablonski, can you explain how deterrence is part of Poland's national strategy?
Thank you very much for, first of all, to invite me for this panel. This is my great pleasure to talk with all the specialists and have the chance to share our Polish approach for the contemporary threats and answer to your questions. Yes, of course. Broadly speaking, Poland adopts three approaches in developing the deterrence posture. This would be depending on the nature of the Russian threat, because the Russian threat is our main point of reference in our strategy. Just small snapshot of our history, not by our choice, but from the 16th century, Kremlin conducted 19 wars with the Poland. So I specifically say Kremlin, not the Russia, because usually the leaders of this country has always some kind of objection against our country. So back to your questions. This three approaches in our national deterrence strategy is strength in numbers. What does it mean? This means that we want to improve the numbers of our professional military structures. I mean the older services, slowly, not quickly, because this is not mass production. Provide right equipment, no high tech equipment, but the right equipment in correlation with the threats, and also improve the professionalization of the Polish armed forces, also law enforcement and all national human resources reserves as well. Because as everybody know, the conflict we cannot figure out only by the operational forces and professional forces. The second line of approach is the improving the quality national deterrence, which include all the government or agency approaches, and try to maintain the same, almost the same training and the same way of education. And of course, the final approach is that permanent investing and alliance strength. So Poland understands, since we won our independence 1989, and even before, that contribution by our forces to all NATO mission, UN mission, and European mission as well, and other bilateral activities can bring the significant improve our deterrent posture against our adversaries. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, like the NATO flag you have behind you, it really is a sign of the power of alliances and partnerships. It's a powerful symbol. Okay, Sergeant First Class Johnson, like we talked about, you have all the tough questions to answer for all special operations. So can you tell us how you think, your opinion of how special operations forces are going to fit within a U.S. deterrence strategy?
Just first off, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. But just to go on what SecDev Austin summarized, deterrence, the first line defense, preventing conflict when possible is greater than engaging. Clearly, every scenario is different, and we go back and forth between this balance between why should we or why we should not engage with force. What are the pros and cons to meet our ultimate outcome of the event? But I do believe special forces, special operations in many capacities has been the first line defense in many major conflicts. Whether working, in foreign embassies, collaborating, developing our foreign policies amongst our partners. And then operationally, we set conditions for our conventional forces to enter the battlefield and further engage our adversaries. As one entity, we possess many faces and capabilities that help shape and influence diplomatic and strategic outcomes. I feel like we are kind of we're the mediators between our country and our partners. So also, with that, with special operations, we definitely, our abilities to obtain resources or the resources that we do have matched with our capabilities. So then you link that with our access and our placement, can definitely help deter conflict in many different fronts. Thank you.
Great. That was a great example of, the idea of a special operations ambassador and being able to be that liaison element between partner nations. That's great. Thank you for that. In the U.S., our national strategy identifies 5 primary threats to peace and security. Sometimes you hear this as 4+1. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then violent extremist organizations. So I'd like to get a regional perspective on these threats from your perspective. Brigadier Chandler, how can we address Chinese belligerence in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, in your neck of the woods? And who do you believe are the key stakeholders in Australia's area of influence? And how can they better work together for deterrence?
Hey, Rob, I'll start by just offering a reference point, which I found fascinating from my year in India. And that was the Indians would often ask me, and this is 2019, how Australia managed to sort of maintain that balance between being best friends, allies, and partners with the US, and having China as our #1 trading partner. And at the time, I remember saying that I thought it was based on this idea that each of them kind of, I guess, gave us a little bit of, in their terms, curry, I guess, a bit of pressure every now and then, based on the, when the balance tipped one way or the other. But either way, we managed to sort of walk that fine line between the two. And that was 2019. But by the time I came home at the end of 2019, Australia in particular had moved from talking about China and its belligerence in veiled speech and real, I guess, traditional diplomatic terms to being quite direct and open, because it was unavoidable in terms of acknowledging what was going on in our region and very much in our own territorial space. So in terms of how we address the belligerence looking forward, it's very much openly and with transparency. It's indeed with agility as well. And it's interesting for me when I look at the way Australia addresses the Indo-Pacific. At the moment, we've got a very heavy Pacific presence, and we're sort of just developing our Indian Ocean presence. So when we talk about regional security and stability, and again, addressing that balance, which is unfortunately affected deeply by the Chinese activity, we've got a bit of a ways to go in terms of rebalancing that, but we've identified the priority area as the South Pacific in the first instance. And only last week, we've seen a number of agreements identified or declared publicly between China and the Solomon Islands, which give us great concern. So in the past, we might have actually stood back and expressed in quiet corners, our concerns to China and to the Solomons, but instead the Prime Minister and our senior leaders are out front expressing their concerns about security and stability. So we're calling it out and we are challenging it. I think also from a broader perspective, we are looking to get upstream of the physical activity and issues and also the intent. And so while it's to go to the higher end of the issue in terms of belligerence, if we thought about anti-access and area denial as an issue, and it's certainly part of the Chinese strategy as they radiate out from the first and second island chain, from an Australian perspective and from a special operations perspective, we think increasingly about access and placement in terms of getting upstream of that potential bubble, so to speak, and I guess generating a counter A2AD approach by other means. So not waiting until that bubble is established, but using preparation of the environment and OPE in terms of concepts as a way in which to counter that belligerence. In terms of the key stakeholders, well, I'm not quite sure where you kind of draw the lines here, because certainly it's all Indo-Pacific nations, including the US. And, you can then break it down into different groups. So Australia clearly has its closest friends and partners. And under the AUKUS agreement, that does include increasingly the UK and their interests. But, we look at ASEAN, as the major security partner in the region, and we look increasingly to their leadership to help address that regional stability. So, yeah, ASEAN, which is got strong leadership through the Indonesians in particular, is also one of those other partners and stakeholders. And the ASEAN Defence Minister Meeting Plus, of which the US and Australia are partners, becomes one of those mediums through which we do that. We've then got sort of the emerging partners. So under the Quad, India and Japan, who I would have described as non-traditional partners for Australia, are also now emerging as key stakeholders. And we're seeing obviously great strength drawn from that. But equally, as we see the challenges of China, Russia, the Ukraine, we're also seeing how that impacts the region, and that's an Indo-Pacific issue now. I mentioned South Pacific before. The Pacific Island Nations group is one that you need to be very conscious of, and occasionally it is forgotten outside the region. Again, the Solomon Islands, they're a key partner and player in that group. And so as a stakeholder group, we need to be very respectful of them and work with them hand in glove to make sure that their needs are met. And I think overall, the South Pacific step up by Australia has been really important in addressing that. And so when we talk about working better together, there's a few threads that I've started to weave through there. But increasingly, the dialogue part is critical, and more open dialogue, more constructive dialogue, rather than just diplomatic dialogue is certainly part and parcel of the approach. And the special operations community is playing a key role in that, both as an interlocutor, as a medium for demonstrating, I guess, what Australian position and what Australian dialogue means. The operationalisation of international engagement. So as we prepare the environment or conduct OPE serials, that operationalised IE is becoming increasingly important as well. And that takes on all forms. It can be working with partner nations. It can be working in a third country, conducting mobile training teams and other activities to build partner capacity. But it also includes the threats that we face increasingly from natural disasters and high-risk weather events. And while we've got a lot of those in Australia itself, as we go through the region, the role that we Australia play and our neighbours play becomes a contributor to that balancing effect. And often it's one of the breakthrough vehicles for engagement. And look, I think probably by extension, it's an obvious one, but that increased collaboration and sharing across non-traditional lines is proving to be effective. And so, in essence, we're redrawing those lines and the nature of relationships inside the region. And I see that as positive overall, because there is increasingly a concern about that imbalance in the region as a result of that Chinese activity. So sorry, that's a little bit of a monologue, but sort of addresses it from a broad Australian perspective. And suffice to say, Australian SOF are weaving themselves through all of the mediums in terms of achieving that output.
Great, thank you very much. Very insightful, particularly the South Pacific. And I know one of your major partners there is your cousins, New Zealand. So we're so close; you're almost synonymous. So great.
And it's worth stating that when it comes to influence, access and influence, and indeed activity in the region, they're very much punch above their weight, and they are a critical player and balancing influencer, particularly in the South Pacific region.
Great, thank you very much. Colonel Jablonski, giving you a tough question here. With regard to the current war in Ukraine, have we failed to deter Russia? And what do we need to do as partners to deter further aggression?
Thank you very much for these questions. Everybody know right now this the Ukraine war is the more this is the big hotspot right now in the world, absorb all the attention right now, and everybody understand right now that the deterrence from the West, I would say, failure at the beginning. Because the Russia, Mr. Putin made decision to 24 to invade the Ukraine. But we have to understand that the current security environment trends and have the huge influence to how to maintenance and how to provide effective deterrence. This is different than the 2, 3, 4 decades ago. and this increasingly complex issue. But let's leave this not only for the historians who try to understand why deterrence failed. When I look at for deterrence theory, I would say there are two main factors have the impact for effective deterrence: capability and will. Capability means we have some kind of military strength to deliver intolerable damage to adversary. Will is determination to use the strength and deliver the damage. So I would say that both factors was not 100% used before the Russian step on the Ukraine. So we have to analyze what we have to do more in order to avoid such a situation on the next step from the Kremlin regime. I think one of the failure was also we as a West. I'm talking about the West. Everything for every country who is west of the Russia and Belarus, including United States. We talk openly what we are not going to do. So the Russia took the advantage on this and went allocate to escalation in order to achieve their goal and maybe in the future de-escalation. So number one is that we have to definitely not talk openly what we are not going to do in order to make their job, our adversary job, it a little bit more difficult. When we move to the military side of deterrence, probably we could have deployed more forces to Ukraine and train, assist Ukraine military before the conflict. NATO make significant contribution for training of the Ukraine forces, and we can see right now that Ukrainians with brave way defend the country, but we should took more consideration under for deliver more weapons, ammunition before, not right now when we're doing this in a hurry. Because the situation in the Ukraine and the potential aggression of Russia is not growing up from the last 2, 3, 4 months. Poland spoke about this kind of threat for the last 14 years, and most of the specialists call this we are Russia-phobic. We are not Russia-phobic. We are pure, well-thinking nation, just like other ones in the world, who estimate this situation 2008, right after the Georgia war. So when the Crimea Peninsula was taken by the Russia in 2014, well, it was only the confirmation that the deterrence doesn't work. And what we can do, I said couple steps. We have to train the forces, allocate the weapon system in advance, give the chance the partner nation develop themselves on the best way. Of course, sharing the information, but not everything. This typical failure from the partner nations, from the allies, is that, especially from the outside Five Eyes community, is that we always looking for the general information from the United States or the Five Eyes. We have to precise our RFI more with more details and always explain why we need this kind of information. Probably this kind of approach help the owner of information, of intel information, to sharing this in the proper way, because we can see the reason why we can sharing this. And that is another step we have to make forward in order to mitigate or to stop aggression for the next country under the decision of the Mr. Putin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Colonel Jablonski. Your opinion matters. And, in our response, and I think illustrated by President Biden's recent visit to Warsaw, you're really the front line of the NATO alliance here, and really the most important partner to work with in this situation. So I really appreciate your comments. Sergeant First Class Johnson, I'm going to give you the same tough question. Do you think that we failed in our response to deter Russia, and how can we do a better job at deterring them in the future?
Has deterrence failed Russian aggression? No. Can we measure what actually is success and failure of Russian aggression? As a collaborative player on the international stage, I mean, yes, Russia has invaded Ukraine and we failed to prevent that. So yes, but has Russia taken the country? No, they haven't. So how I look at it is, we lost the battle, but not the war. Right now, yes, we are leading with diplomacy, levying heavy sanctions, but will that eventually be enough? Or is that going to be when, will military force be introduced aside of Ukraine and Russia? I don't know that answer. But once again, we have this back and forth of what if, what's going to happen. But as of Russian aggression continues to influence other countries, I would say especially NATO allies, the Baltics, that similar potential invasion like Ukraine amongst these other partners that we have. And I believe that the continued collaboration of resources and training will definitely strengthen our relationship and our fighting power amongst each other, improving our foreign policies, that nothing is better than, as we plan, we prepare, to eventually one day execute when that time is called upon. But I feel that ultimately this end state that is continuously developing as, as conditions change, the idea is that we need to show this strong unified front and make our adversaries think twice before acting. That's only going to change how we move forward with this topic.
Oh, great. Thank you. I had to unmute. Okay. So next question really has to do with the fact that defense spending worldwide is growing, and that's growing in our adversaries, but it's also growing in our allies. So I'm wondering how this might affect our relationships in the future, particularly with special operations. So particularly with Australia and Poland, if you could please elaborate how defense spending is affecting special operations, not just in terms of hardware, but in education in your forces. Brigadier Chandler, how is increased defense spending affecting Australian SOF?
Well, Rob, very timely question, because last night the Australian government actually handed down their budget. And this is ahead of an expected election in the next 4 to 8 weeks. So, it's quite prescient. And in fact, this election is being identified or coined the khaki election. So a lot of the debate, if you like, will be around defence and security and the spending associated with it. So while it might be modest by US terms, from a defence perspective, the government confirmed an envelope of $575 billion was going to be spent in the defence portfolio between now and 2029. As ever, some of that money already existed. Some of it's being, I guess, reallocated or readjusted, and some of it is new money. From a SOF perspective, we had already been allocated a $3 billion envelope for ongoing modernisation and evolution over a 20-year window from 2016. About half a billion dollars of that has already been committed, and we've been working through with a number of projects to essentially allocate that funding against various projects and platforms. So in the first instance, it was submersibles and surface vessels to contemporise our SOF's maritime and marinized capability. And then there was a whole range of land-based platforms that also attracted significant amount of capital investment. There's been a modernisation, if you like, across the soldier systems as well that support the SOF community. So on one side of the capability, the operator, so to speak, has been allowed to make that jump into the post-Afghan, post-Iraq era and really set the conditions for operating in the major power competition era. I guess linked to that, the other part for Special Operations Command linked to that defence spending is an increased investment in the technology side, and that goes through a sort of a multi-domain spectrum. And to give you a physical reference point, what we're seeing is a lot of our operations are being conducted in more of a supporting or enabling role to allow the Australian Signals Directorate or other entities, to achieve broader outcomes, if you like. So I did hear one operator, and this is not my quote and not my opinion, but I did hear one operator suggest that, hey, I'm transitioning from being, the door kicker to the Uber driver, and I'm enabling those more higher end capabilities. And while that might be a bit unkind, I guess it was a recognition that we are evolving quickly, and we are comfortable with this idea that when you look at defence spending, when you look at priorities, and when you look at where you get best bang for buck, the whole capability has to, I guess, rapidly adjust to that human technology teaming space. That's also obviously driving evolved skill sets. So across the SOF community, it isn't necessarily the traditional operator skill sets that are dominating as we move forward. Those martial skill sets are still important, and we're benchmarking against our key partners and allies, but we're also starting to look at where we get I guess an edge. And so you're seeing a greater investment in talent identification, and then talent attraction from a really broad skill set, and that lateral recruiting of, say, a person who's been working for BHP, who's a high-end scientist or engineer, who has a skill set that, when partnered with a few other areas, allows us to start to get upstream, as I was talking about earlier, and then equally further integrate other parts of the defence capability. And then coming back to that defence spending, Australia's always considered itself pretty joint, and certainly the SOF community has been the exemplar. But going into this next epoch, if you like, it's all about how you harness the effect across all domains, and how Army, Navy, Air Force, and then the SOF components linked to the other departments, whether it's the signals side of it or the broader intelligence side, are further integrated to achieve that collective outcome. The other point I'll just make associated with that, the idea of what security, national security and the national interest means is also taking on a broader definition. So previously, where we might not have had as intimate a relationship with industry or academia, we're seeing that evolve to the next level, and the defence spending envelope is also adjusting and adapting accordingly. So while we've got, our, I think on average, we're about $48 billion a year in our defence budget, we're also seeing that in other portfolios now, there is a defence or security component. So depending on how you want to aggregate that effect, there is a lot more capacity being generated through an access, not own approach. And again, SOF are proving to be the exemplars of that. And, using the Chief of Army's language, we're thinking big, starting small and moving fast. And so that's becoming a really critical part of the defence spending, or the approach to defence spending, and how you get a quick return on that, but also how you measure that over several decades. I'll pause there, but happy to come back to that in the future in question time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Colonel Jablonski, same question for you. Can you give us some insight into how your defense budget might be impacting special operations capabilities, both in terms of equipment and education?
Thank you very much for this question, Rob. The good story is that almost 2 weeks ago and last week, our president signed the national bill who obligate all the national asset to contribute for our nation defense. So this is the pretty big bill. The new law who allocated the responsibilities for every single department or our government, and also describe the mechanism of the financial support for our self-defense. So and also we have the first time in our history during the next couple of years and our spending for the defense will be the equal 3% of GDP. Right now it's around the 2.2. So this is in terms of how much money is almost in this year will be the $14 billion, which is the huge amount of money for my size of the country. And this kind of we're still waiting for the low level decision and guidelines how we have to implement the main point of this national bill. However, I can say that would be the strong investment for the special forces, Polish special forces, who played one of the significant role on the eastern flank. We are one of the leading nation on the eastern flank, and we are not looking for our neighbors from the NATO as the only subordinate, but dedicated nation who dedicate their self to our structures. But we always maintain with them the proper diplomatic relationship and understanding each other what is the way constraints and limits in order to work together on the best way. So being the leading nation on the south, on the east, on the soft flank, this kind of investment for our internal budget is very important, and we looking for this, not only spending this budget on to maintain our human resources, but also how to educate and how to buying and possess the I would say one more time right technology, not the high technology, because not everything as allies we need what we exist on the market, on the military market. And sometimes we saw on the in our history some kind of tendency to buying everything which is on the high level quality or what is the new on the market in terms of the weapon system. Now we have the special procedures of acquisition where we have to look at what exactly we need in order to improve our and our allies' capability who work with us. In terms of the education, I think and I'm sure that our professional military education in Poland have to be still modernized. I have to still be update. We have the couple plans to change this education of a pipeline of education. Of course, we have also based on support international education center, NATO education center, US education center, and that will be some kind of additional factor who can help our guys to work on the properly against the 21st century threats. Of course, in this kind of forum, I cannot talk about the details. However, the SOF in Poland is right now on the top of the interest of our national decision makers. And again, we want to allocate our time, money, investment more precise than was the last decade in order to be more interoperable with our allies, in order to avoid any kind of mistakes for the next step from the Russia. And we want to invest for our education as well for the professional officer corps, but also NCO. And we understood this for last decade that the SOF is very unique, but we have to implement all the lesson learned quickly and faster than our allies, than our adversaries.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Colonel Jablonski. Yeah, the fact that you talked about interoperability and also Brigadier Chandler, the fact that acquisition is taking interoperability with allies is a key component of procurement is really fascinating. And to get to that, circling back to Sergeant First Class Johnson, where do you see the future collaboration between the U.S. SOF and our partners whose capabilities are increasing at the moment?
One, it's going to continue, and it will never stop. Because the big thing is that ultimately we need to share our strengths with our partners, because one day we are going to be called upon to fight together hand in hand. Now, obviously, we are conducting this either through individual training or joint training to these large, culminating joint exercises amongst multiple players. We bring this integrated deterrence concept to practice on our operative stage through, like I said, multiple different platforms. Now, the theme and concept, we can say is how do we actually take all these capabilities and mesh them together with our partners' capabilities. Now, the key thing is we're not trying to change how one operates, but ultimately, like I said, how we mesh together and how we can work bilaterally, also multilaterally, work together to complete the mission. Clearly, there's a strength in one's capability, fills the void to make up, the weakness of another, and vice versa. Collectively, I believe every party, wants to improve their own capabilities, internally. We want to be the best at what we do. Now, with working with partners, I feel like you see things at a different vantage point, a different, point of view. And in turn, we can evaluate ourselves and adapt those things, adapt what, our partners are doing, because maybe it actually works better than how we do things. And that will allow us to, make changes for us to become more effective internally, but then also with our partners against our adversaries, moving forward. Like I said, there's a lot of different avenues, whether it's by land, air, or sea. And I know, a big push lately has been this maritime capability. So that was one thing that, we worked on when I took my trip to the Baltics, is working that maritime piece.
Great, thank you much. All right, I'm going to take a couple questions here from the audience. First one's for Colonel Jablonski. The National Resistance Strategy, which has been a key concept for SOF over the last 10 years, in Ukraine appears to be working very well, and better than anticipated by most, I think, as the war started. So how important is the national resistance strategy going forward in the fourth age of SOF, and how can we better prepare for that?
Thank you very much for these questions. This is the question which the national resistance is very close to every single pole. So we, as many people know, that we conduct the resistance for ages, and we understood how important is the common resistance against the threat. So of course, the 21st century required a little bit different part of this concept to develop even further. I would say the SOF always plays significant role to improve the national resistance. That statement. Okay, now how to do it? This is the pretty much we conduct this on our own society for the last 4 or 5 years. One of our service, Territorial Defense Army, was built by the Polish SOF, because we realized that when we spend more than 20 years on the global war of terror, and we conduct the military assistance in Afghanistan, Iraq, in other places, we asked one day, something like that 7 years ago, why we cannot implement SOF to build our own capability by military assistance with our society. So successfully, we're moving to the proper way, and we build this Territorial Defense Army. Most of the commanders and from this service, Territorial Defense Army, is from the Polish SOF. So Territorial Defense Army and the Polish SOF are the two main backbones of national resistance. Of course, we are supported by the special services, secret service, in order to implement the plan in proper way across our country, especially keeping the focus on the urban areas as the place where we can expect that the national resistance, as we can see in Ukraine, take place. So what does it mean for SOF yet? We have to develop our collaboration and cooperation with the other agency in order to complete this national resistance concept, because there's not only responsibility people with the uniform and not people who were trained in the compulsory service or voluntary service, but all the people who can keep the weapon maybe we don't have chance to keep the weapon. Maybe we have by the health, we only have the chance to keep the back with the medical stuff. So every single citizen, I would say, in total defense, have the rules in national resistance. This is our point of view in Poland, and in order to make this in smart way, we have to give the chance by the soft hands to train all our society who will be available to defend the country. I think this is the common pattern for the rest of the nation as well in the world. I have I know the plenty examples like the Sweden or Estonia who implement the total defense, where the national resistance concept supported by the SOF play a significant role.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, in Europe, the Baltics, Norway, Sweden, Poland, Ukraine, all these countries, this has become like a primary facet of defense. And so, my question back to Brigadier Chandler, as we switch theaters here to the Pacific, is there a resistance and resilience strategy? Can this be replicated with the vulnerable states that exist in the Indo-Pacific, or do you think this is a viable strategy for SOF to champion in your region?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Rob. And I think from a language point of view, we'd probably still be short of being comfortable sort of promoting resistance as a method at the moment. It might imply that we're already in a degree of suppression or control that needs to be countered. So certainly, while the issue of influence from major powers, other parties is of significant concern, we definitely favour the approach to resilience, and as the US has done for years, promote a by, with, and through approach to strengthening our partners and neighbours' ability to support themselves in the first, or secure themselves in the first instance, and then integrate or provide some sort of overarching support that very much reinforces their sovereignty, but allows them to benefit from the best of our capabilities and our access and placement in the region. So that's certainly an evolving space. And when we were talking about education earlier, I didn't talk about the special warfare program, but while it does draw much of its inspiration, if you like, from the traditional USSF program, it's also got that classic Australian dimension to it that we're developing as we go, and it also borrows liberally from our history and heritage. And it's worth mentioning that, because when I talked also about getting upstream and again preparing the environment earlier, we are recognising that whether it's the South Pacific nations or our Indian Ocean partners and neighbours, we have to have a better relationship, and we have to be more present, more often, and be more useful. And equally, we need to be more respectful of their particular needs and priorities. And so I think we, particularly Australian SOF, but we, the Australian Defence Force, are becoming more effective, and our senior leaders are allowing us more latitude, if you like, to interpret that at the tactical and operational level, and then enable the strategic output. So, when you come back to resistance and resilience, we're not quite into the resistance game yet, but all of this is about, I guess, preparing for that and ensuring that if that requirement came along, certainly our partners and friends were appropriately prepared. But from a national resilience and security point of view, absolutely, we are investing in that in the region, with a real dominance on favouring the sovereignty of our partners and friends.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, what a nuanced perspective between the theaters. It's interesting to see that. So starting first class Johnson, a question for you. Terrorism seems to be a waning topic at the moment. There's hostilities right now in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia, but they just don't seem to hit the press. But the Middle East doesn't seem to be winding down. So, and particularly Africa, which seems to be exploding at the moment. So, what does the future of counterterrorism look like, and how do we prepare for that as we try to shift towards strategic competition? What partnering opportunities are there that we should be taking advantage of?
Yeah, once again, yeah. So terrorism, I think will always be around. It's something that will never go away. I think what we are kind of seeing now with it, not making the news and just kind of being playing a back role is that I feel terrorism is taking a different role, if not a different form. I think part of too, with the pullout of Afghanistan, so there's no way it's showing like a shift with what we are trying to do, kind of go back to our roots of this unconventional style of warfare. But once again, terrorism, I think, is ultimately now going to the future. It's just taking a different form. I mean, it's a violence and a fear tactic that is being put out. We're not, I think before terrorism was kind of just linked to anything with jihadists. And I think that it's just taken a different form from that now. Why can't we say what Russia invasion of, Ukraine was not a form of terrorism, just in a newer, right, what we maybe not have defined yet in this new environment, but we are still countering it. Like I said, special operations has many facets to it, and just because we are moving in a different view, or not necessarily view, but just putting assets and our focus somewhere else, doesn't mean we're not still training and taking measures and planning for when attacks are still going on in the Middle East, in Northern Africa and stuff like that. So we are still planning, we're still preparing, we're still training for those things. It's just, it might not be at the top or one of our priorities now. We're focusing on other things.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Great perspective from the force at the moment. We've got another question for you, Colonel Jablonski. This is from Joseph Shepard. So back to the question about the lack of deterrence in the current fight in Ukraine and kind of how it's evolved. How do we mitigate, or how do we leverage information operations to better take advantage of deterrence in this irregular warfare space, so that we don't show our weakness and that we show strength?
Thank you very much for these questions. In terms of the information operation, we have to understand that the capability of information operation, conduct information operation between the allies is different, especially between the SOF. Not every SOF have this kind of capability. So in some nation can respond by conventional assets of information operation. Some of them have the opportunity and law and the rights authority to do it by the SOF. So in answer to these questions, we have to provide both ways, sometimes equal. Defense information operation activity and offense information operation activity. What I see, at least from my level, from my private perspective, Ukraine is doing good job with the information operation right now. So I would say they take advantage over the Russian. Even we were scared about the Russian capability of information operation, because as we know that Russian have very long history to provide deception, how I call it, this maskirovka in Russian language. And I expect that from early beginning, Russian will win this kind of, will take advantage over the Ukraine. I didn't see such a thing, at least from my level. In order to be more effective, we have to provide the information operation campaign against our adversaries with more cooperation, more synchronized between the nation. We cannot do it bilateral approach against our adversary, or the two ways. We have to talk like the European Union or NATO against Russia. We have the good example where before the crisis, before the war, when the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, sent letters to every single nation in Europe who is against, I would say, and who is pro-Russian approach. and he never get the answer. He got the answer by the all European Union nation. So this means that we can implement the same approach for information operation. We have to be, first of all, not scared to be offensive, and we have to also improve interoperability in terms of the information operation between the nation.
That's a great point. I'm pretty certain you found a critical gap in our capabilities. I don't think that we integrate our information campaigns very well. Thank you very much for that. I think you downplayed President Zelensky and Ukraine's ability to do information operations. It's like a professor at the university right now. I think we should all be taking notes. It's very, very impressive. Here's a question from Antonio Elman, offered up to you, Brigadier Chaloner. In regard to educational arena, what aspects do you identify as critical needs that need to be modified or maybe subjects added to our curriculum in order to increase our effectiveness at deterrence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's funny, in our own context, well, I think SOF have always been pretty entrepreneurial in their approach. And we'd argue that we sort of experiment while we're in the fight, that we're pretty good at failing fast and, critically debriefing ourselves and resetting as we go. I still think there is both an art and a science to doing that and to doing that at scale. And so certainly in our context, we're starting to add that sort of entrepreneurial type education into our curriculum. I would advocate that more broadly. And when you think about the agile sprint methodology, which comes out of the IT industry, as an alternate method for planning and preparation, we're finding it to be extremely effective as well. So I guess we're borrowing from some of the other mediums, and I'm always skeptical about borrowing things from the commercial business sector, but I think in this case those things have relevance, and I would most definitely be adding them to the curriculum as a priority. Now, linked to that, but probably a little more broadly, I talked about human technology teaming earlier, and while all of our personnel are inherently, they're smart, they're capable, they're agile, they're adaptable, there is still another level of education that goes with that human technology teaming. And whether we're enabling, an information operation or a cyber operation, or we're operating the grey zone spectrum, or we're doing something else, I do think there's a dimension of our development that is probably still missing. And from a military perspective, might be held back by some of our traditional, cultural biases. So that would be my intuitive response to that question.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Sergeant First Class Johnson to also piggyback on that. What do you see in our education and training that needs to kind of shape or change, or maybe something needs to add to help us be better at deterrence?
I mean, one, so we, obviously we have our, we have to learn a language, and that's part of being able to adapt to the culture we're in, being able to communicate with our partners, because if anything, if we're not communicating properly, then there's going to be a disconnect in how we operate. So communication is huge. So that's obviously something that's always growing with our communication piece. But also, I think it's actually understanding the culture itself, the atmospherics of where we're operating, understanding where, what has happened in the past, the history, where we're operating, because obviously, sometimes history tends to repeat itself, but also just learn from what's going on. And, it's those key indicators that by understanding what that culture brings, what is going on currently there, wherever the AO we're operating. But obviously, it's those key indicators that we can start picking up on that, hey, we're noticing these habits that are coming up. Maybe this is about to happen. And then it gives us the insight that, hey, maybe we need to act this way and how to prevent a future problem that could arise.
Great. Yep. Language and culture is really important. Thanks for reinforcing that. That's very important for how we integrate into deterrence. Colonel Jablonski, a question for you. private military companies appear to be proliferating. We saw Russia's use of Wagner Group both in Crimea as well as Syria. Where do you see the future threats of private military companies, and how do we counter those?
Thank you very much for this question. The private military companies. This is the phenomena on the 21st century. But the profession of the soldier of fortune, mercenaries, volunteers, however we call it, them, is one of the oldest profession in the world. So we couldn't be surprised that we have private military companies in front of us in some places, just like Americans had in Syria a couple years ago in February 7. I don't want to talk about this battle, but we probably everybody know this story. So sooner or later we can meet the PMC in some places in Ukraine. There 2 days ago was the message that more than 1,000 was deployed to the eastern part of Ukraine. So I will narrowing the approach how we can dealing with such a issue. First of all, we have to be prepared for this. So we have to share the information about it. As I said, answering the first question, whenever the nation ask about the PMC on specific terrain, and to explain why we need this information, we have to get this information. Depends what kind of level of who is the owner of the information. So definitely sharing the information in order to prepare themselves. I mean the SOF or the conventional forces to fight with this kind of group of the people. The second point is the planning, because we have to include whenever we realize that we have the PMC on the other side, we have to include this for the planning process with more details, including the legal factor of this, because those people who choose this kind of profession, in my understanding, we have the different law protection to compare with the conventional forces or special forces under the Geneva Convention. But whenever we talk the PMC in the Ukraine, we have to remember what's happened after post-ISIS migration, well-experienced fighters to the Europe. So we have to remember that the planning process have to include also how we mitigate the threat from PMC when the war of Ukraine ending, because someday I believe that we end. So in other words, the planning process as the second step after the preparation have to be include how we can conduct operation against them and how we mitigate the threat for these people out after the war. In other words, we have to share the information about the transfer of these well-experienced fighters from one place to another, or the part of the company from one place to another between the allies.
That's excellent. There's at least one person thinking about what's going to happen after the war. That's great. Probably another thing we should be thinking about is what's our stance with Russia after the war, and how do we circle back to that? Maybe in bringing it closer to the fold and further away. But here's a question here for Brigadier Chandler. From your perspective, your foxhole, as we say, what's the largest challenge for SOF in the fourth age? And what keeps you up at night? What is the thing that you're most concerned with as a commander with all of Western Australia under your heel? What is it that you think we need to work on the most?
I'll probably steal a few words from our Chief of Army, who again is another SOF officer, but having more people, more places, more of the time. And as I've had to look at the problem set in the context of the Indian Ocean region, it's 90 million square kilometres around the Indian Ocean, and taking its rim. In Australia, we're a small force, currently about 80,000 full time. we've just had an announcement that will grow by 18,000. So this is the Australian Defence Force. SOF will get a modest component of that, but the demands for all of our forces, but particularly our SOF, are increasing exponentially. And hence the human technology teaming becomes important so that you can maximise the capacity that you've got. And equally, that access not own approach becomes important as well. So in the first instance, I feel that I want to have more presence in more places so that we can increase the level of influence that we have in an appropriate form and counter the influence of malign actors. And then I think as part of that, the enablement of those personnel and those force elements becomes critical as well. And some of it will be pretty predictable and pretty standard, and some of it's going to be novel. So therefore, having more authorities and more trust to get upstream will be, I guess, an additional part of the approach that we need to take. And while some elements of the capability have always had a fair degree of freedom, through the paradigms of Iraq and Afghanistan, I do think we got quite locked into a tactical context, and therefore those authorities and even those freedoms really got simplified or locked down. So all of that needs to change if we want to have the appropriate influence. And back to our Defence Strategic Update, it recognises that we can't take on some of our, I guess, the other state actors pound for pound. But it doesn't mean that we aren't going to take them on in an appropriate form. And to that end, the other thing that I link to this is the fact that our two key state actors or adversaries at this stage have been very clear that they've changed the rules. They don't like the rules that we've, I guess, grown up on or that we've established as part of the liberal world order and otherwise. And while it doesn't mean that morally and ethically we would compromise ourselves, it does mean we need to do things differently. So I sort of partner those other concerns with the fact that we need to do things differently. And that's going to take us into some increasingly uncomfortable spaces, both in our region and in the way in which we operate.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Our next question here is for Sergeant First Class Johnson. Now you're on point for all of Army NCOs and SOF. This question, somebody did the math for you. As an Army NCO, you represent 82% of Army SOF. Congratulations. But you're the only enlisted member on this panel, right? So do you think that in the 21st century, enlisted personnel should be integrated at a higher rate into higher education, different levels of institutions, better training at JSOU, or in the force? What do you believe?
I believe we most definitely should be integrated in these higher institutes. I mean, we definitely, as an NCO Corps, we bring a unique viewpoint to how the Army or any agency operates. Whatever service you are part of, but we bring a unique object because we kind of see things how they are or how we're actually executing. We're not necessarily painting the picture of what we're trying to do. We're actually doing what is based on our guidance, and we're executing. Completing the basics and perfecting the basics, and teaching others to do those key tasks. I feel, being at USMA, I feel that there could be more NCOs here, but like I said, we bring a unique perspective to how we operate. And I think what also, not necessarily what we're doing, but it also gives a better idea for these future leaders to understand and how to lead better. Like this is how we view things, this is how we're seeing it, and try to help them, develop their leadership capabilities and, their character, but it's just helping them understand, like, this is what's going on. This is what we see. This is, and how to help them become better, effective leaders, for our forces in the future of their military careers.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. So we're going to follow up with one final question for all of you, if we can make it all fit. This panel is about deterrence and partnerships and what we can do to deter basically our four primary threats from aggression. So leaving it up to you and your final thoughts, what do you think we can do better as partners? I'll start off with Brigadier Chandler.
I'm definitely on the theme of integration and collaboration. And while I think, from an Australian perspective, we've got a number of boosters to that through the AUKUS agreement, through the Quad, and through a number of other initiatives. Equally, coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't necessarily have that natural pull into the NATO space or other non-traditional spaces that we might have had over the last 20 years. So there is a need to evolve those relationships and take them into this new context. And as much as possible, it doesn't necessarily recognise or require us to be like for like, but you do need to be complementary. And even if it's a situational relationship, so it could be Poland and Australia working on an area of mutual interest in the Indian Ocean region, for example. Maybe it's a long bow to draw, but to me, that should be as natural as waking up in the morning and going for a run. So I think there is a lot more work to be done there. And I think maybe some traditional concerns or constraints need to be put to one side in the broader global interests.
That's excellent. Circling back to the human domain, it's so important. Colonel Jablonski, for you, what are your final thoughts on deterrence and partnerships? What can we do better?
I agree with this kind of statement that first of all we have to work closer to each other, more collaboration, more cooperation, more exercise, because I would say that by physical activity plus education, joint education, multinational education, we can understand each other and we can learn from each other quickly, and we have to minimize the time but from what we learn to implement the best solution, and not scared that somebody is not NATO or Five Eyes, no Five Eyes. Everybody talk about it, but we want to see more on the ground level that we sharing this best practices, lesson learned, information and intel quicker and more effective, and trust between each other, which is easy to achieve on the tactical level, operational level, and so especially between the SOF. So we have to continue this and provide one united message to our adversary. Don't open to them, don't scare them, calculate in smart way deterrence, and don't scare to protect your nation, and don't scare about the reaction from the second side. So the more we can work together, educate together, understand each other. My grandfather always told me the best natural trainer is the pain, mental or the physical. So don't scare. We have to keep this momentum and not scare about the future.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Sergeant First Class Johnson, you're the closer. Closing arguments from you.
I agree with both the other panelists. Communication, sharing of intellect and information across all services and platforms in general, and then leading to our training. The collaborating, the bilateral, multilateral partners, and our training operations that we conduct. That because in the end, one day we are going to be called to work hand in hand, and it's having that trust that each other are going to do what they're supposed to do and bring their strengths to the fight.
Well, great. Thank you all, gentlemen, for your participation in this panel. Thank you, Brigadier Chandler, for not getting any sleep tonight and joining us from Perth. And thank you for your comments, both from the senior enlisted ranks and also for your very important comments about Ukraine today from Colonel Jablonski. I yield the rest of my time to Charlie, if he's available.
Thank you, Dr. Burrell and panelists, for that excellent discussion on the importance of partnerships and alliances and SOF role in maintaining those.